G'day everyone, my name's Lawrence Bryant and I'm a New Zealander and I've survived Covid-19. Oh man, even though I kept on working, even though I just kept on doing what I had to do, I did not go on lockdown in any way, shape or form. But some way, shape or form, I managed to survive Covid-19. So I figured, you know what, I need to do a video about just how and why New Zealand's done so damn well in regards to surviving this outbreak. I mean, our government and our Prime Minister is being lauded throughout the world as being this incredible savior of mankind and humanity, and she's done this incredible humane act of kindness and compassion and saved New Zealand from the wrath of Covid-19. So I figured, yeah, you know what? Yeah, let's look at just why New Zealand has done so incredibly well in regards to getting through this outbreak, this big pandemic, right? So, first and foremost, beginning in March, we really started to hear about this virus, about the outbreak, and what was going on around the world, and how it was the end of times. It's like everything's collapsing. The world's going to end up, millions of people are going to die, So by March 16th, there was an article that came out in the New Zealand Herald, and it was, we are going to have the most strictest lockdown measures on the planet. We're going to go into a full-blown lockdown. We're going to be shutting down businesses. People are going to be staying home. We're going to lock the borders down and... Lock the borders down? Did we lock the borders down? No, we didn't. Here's something that all of you folk don't realize, is that at the beginning, when everything went on lockdown, there was one thing that was left wide open, and that was the borders. See, the New Zealand government was flying thousands of New Zealanders back home from overseas. And not just New Zealanders that were travelling, we're talking about New Zealanders that actually live overseas. New Zealanders that have made the conscious decision to leave this country and move overseas and live in a foreign country. I did it. I lived overseas for 26 years in the United States. I came home last year, March, 2 days after the terrorist attack. And that's another whole story. So, even though the government had put the country on a full lockdown and had sent everybody home, they still kept on flying New Zealanders into New Zealand. And guess where the virus was coming from? It hadn't gotten wings and flown across the Pacific. It hadn't gotten fins and flippers and gills and swam across the Pacific. No, the virus was flown in on big aluminum chickens. These big kerosene burning aluminum chickens that fly all around the world. And that's where we started getting our infection rate from. You see, March 16th, when the article hit the New Zealand Herald, we're at about 6 people in New Zealand total in regards to this virus. And what I'll do is I'll leave a link in the description section below, and you can go to the New Zealand Ministry of Health's website, click on cases, and go down and you will see the actual numbers. And then I'm not BSing you. I'm being 100% honest with you. So what happened was after March 18th, you start to see an uptick in the infection rate down here in New Zealand. And then all of a sudden it starts taking off. Why did it start taking off? Because the New Zealand government flew into New Zealand in the first 2 weeks 45 to 50,000 New Zealanders that were living overseas, that were either travelling or living overseas. And they weren't going into any form of quarantine facility. It was literally like the New Zealand government was purposely bringing the actual virus into New Zealand to justify shutting the country down. I can't make this shit up. It's right there on the New Zealand Ministry of Health's website. But here's the amazing thing. is that after the end of March, the beginning of April, you start to see the curve starting to drop off. But yet on April 9th, the New Zealand government and our illustrious leader, the self-professed feminist and saviour of mankind, Jacinda Ardern, she comes out and says all New Zealanders must go into quarantine facilities now. But the curve's already dropping off. Seriously, April 9th, the curve's already dropping off. Now she wants to put New Zealanders into quarantine facilities. But what are those quarantine facilities? 5-star hotels. Seriously, the New Zealanders returning home from overseas were put into 5-star hotels down the road here in Auckland. And I mean, Auckland is just down the road. It's like that way, about, I don't know, 10 kilometres. So the reality of the situation is that, one, the borders weren't on lockdown. Two, 45 to 50,000 New Zealanders in the first 2 weeks were flown into this country. And three, because they were flying all those New Zealanders from overseas back into this country, we saw an incredibly fast increase in virus cases in this country because none of them were self-quarantining. Because we had no quarantine facilities, they were meant to go into self-quarantine. Well, I can't make this shit up. We actually have friends of ours down in Blenheim, okay, whose kids came back from London. Their son and their son's girlfriend came back from England, and boom, after they returned, there they are the next day on Facebook. Were they self-quarantining? No. They're out there in the public. They're out there in a local park. Woo! Look at us. We're back in New Zealand. Woo-hoo-hoo. We've frickin' saved our own hides. You see, what a lot of you folk overseas don't understand is New Zealand has a policy. They will actually fly New Zealanders back to New Zealand free of charge. Now, admittedly, when you get back here, if you get yourself settled, get yourself a job, then you have to pay the government back. But hey, the country's in lockdown. There's been 45, 50,000 New Zealanders return home. Nobody's working. Ain't going to be anybody paying that airfare back anytime soon. And guess who? Guess who got the first major bailout? Who got the first big billion-dollar bailout from the government right at the beginning? Any guesses? Air New Zealand. The New Zealand government gave Air New Zealand $1 billion, and the birds were flying in and out of New Zealand like nothing else on earth. Just over that way, I can see the birds flying in for Auckland International Airport. They were constantly coming in. And I'm not talking about the freight coming into the country. I'm talking about the passenger jets. They were flying in tens of thousands of New Zealanders into this country. But like I said, right at April, the beginning of April, the curve is starting to drop off. And Jacinda Ardern comes out on April 9th and mandates that New Zealanders returning from overseas need to go into quarantine facilities, which are actually 5-star hotels. Now here's the amazing thing. The New Zealand police force down in Canterbury, down in Christchurch, went around 50 homes one day. And you know how many of those young people that had flown back from overseas were self-isolating? Out of 50 homes they visited, how many homes had their people in them that were self-isolating? Any guesses? Anyone? Half? 25 homes? Maybe 10? Two frickin' homes had the residents in them that were meant to be self-isolating. These Muppets were out there in the world running around like headless chickens, spreading the virus. So even though that was happening, we were still seeing a drop-off. Even though there's tens of thousands of New Zealanders flying in, being flown into the country, even though people weren't self-isolating, we still were having a drop-off. But the government, April 9th, they had to mandate this self-isolation situation to make it look like they were under control, that they had this thing under control. But naturally, the virus infection rate wasn't taking off like they were anticipating. They were expecting 80,000 deaths down here in New Zealand. Even though they were bringing the virus into the country and they were flying tens of thousands of people into New Zealand. It said 100,000 New Zealanders have returned home as of today. Okay? Even though they've got these thousands of people coming home, the infection rate has been in the toilet. Why is that? Why is that happening? I'm going to give you a little bit of demographic information in regards to New Zealand. And this correlates to the rest of the world also. Demographics play a huge part and nobody looks at this information. New Zealand's demographic is 5 million people, just over 5 million people spread out over a country of 260,000 square kilometres. We're a very sparsely populated country. Even though I live in Auckland City, okay, and Auckland City is literally like 10 kilometres that way, out there is countryside. Around me is countryside. If you travelled around Auckland City, you will see hundreds of thousands of individual homes. And Auckland's population is approximately 1.5 million people. And it's spread out over an area of 1,100 square kilometres. So it's actually not a densely populated city. When you look at London, okay, London, England, it is a population of 9 million people. That's just about 2 times the entire population of New Zealand crammed into an area of 1,600 square kilometres. So where do they put these people when you have millions of people crammed into a small area? It's no different with New York. New York City is the exact same. Another highly infected area. You have 8.3 million people crammed into an area of 800 square kilometres. I mean, these are hugely dense populations in a very tight area, in an area of landmass that's not too dissimilar to Auckland, New Zealand. Okay? Well, they get put in high-rise apartment buildings. There's only a handful of modest high-rise apartment buildings in the main city. Once you get outside of the main city, there's nothing but individual residential homes. We're already got the isolation between each and every individual home. Whereas in London, in New York, and even in Italy, in northern Italy, you've got very tight, dense populations of people, and you've got multi-generations of people living under one roof. I work for a company here in New Zealand that's actually supplying building materials for some of these apartment blocks in London, England, and you're seeing upwards of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people in each high-rise building. That's a huge amount of people in one frickin' building. Some of these buildings in London, just one building has more people living in them than many of the small little towns around New Zealand. New Zealand is an incredibly spread out population. I mean, let's just look at London, let's just look at England, period. England itself is spread out over 130,000 square kilometres. So England is half the size of New Zealand. New Zealand has 5 million people. England has 67 million people on a landmass that's just basically about the same size as the North Island of New Zealand, just a little bit bigger. That's 12 times the population of New Zealand in a single area. That's a hugely dense population. So these are some of the factors that played into New Zealand's success. is even though they were bringing the virus in thick and fast, even though they were trying to get the country infected, even though there wasn't any quarantine facilities or any sort of testing on any way, shape or form for the first couple of weeks, we started to see a drop-off in the infection rate. It wasn't because of the government, it was because of our demographics down here. But there's one other thing, and this is a big one, and nobody thinks about this. And I've spoken to hundreds of people out there over the last couple of months because I kept on working. I'd talk to people at supermarkets, I'd talk to people wherever. I kept on doing what I had to do. I wasn't buying into any of this bullshit. The one thing that nobody gave any thought to. Any idea? It was summertime down here. Yeah, summertime. Those countries up in the northern hemisphere at the beginning of this year, they were still in wintertime. March this year, wintertime. It gets colder than a witch's tit in Europe, Russia, England, New York, all across the United States, Canada, Italy. It was all wintertime. For God's sakes, the virus needs to be in an environment that's 18 degrees Celsius or colder. It was summertime down here, for God's sakes. That's why Australia's done really well. Summertime, and it's close to the equator. Really toasty environment. New Zealand didn't have to shut down. It didn't have to shut down in any way, shape or form. We were naturally in an absolutely perfect environment to avoid any major deaths in regards to this outbreak. And here's the interesting thing. Even though Auckland City, and Auckland, it is that way. It's only 10 kilometres that way. And you can see the countryside around me. Even though Auckland was one of the more highly infected areas of New Zealand, we saw no deaths. And it's because we have a very, very mild climate up here. We're just starting. We're in May right now. We're just starting to go into wintertime. Just in the last couple of weeks, last week or so. The temperatures have just started getting cold. Okay? The deaths that we have had in New Zealand have all been at the bottom of the South Island, from Canterbury down into Otago. Predominantly, that's where the majority of deaths have been. Out of the 21 deaths, 90-odd% of them have been down on the bottom of the South Island. Why is that? Well, one, it's closer to the Arctic Circle, and two, it's cold down there. Even though up here in the North Island, at the top of the North Island, we have a more subtropical climate. At the bottom of the South Island, we have a colder climate. And it's the same thing in Ireland. People are like, well, what about Ireland, dude? You know, Ireland's the same population as New Zealand. Oh my God. Ireland is 83,000 square kilometres. It's like 3 times smaller than New Zealand. It's about half the size of the North Island of New Zealand, with 5 million people on it. It's a more densely populated area. They've got more densely populated urban areas. If people don't look, they've got buildings on top of buildings on top of buildings, these old villages and everything. The buildings are right beside each other. They've got multi-generations across the board in those homes, and wintertime. New Zealand, again, was perfectly situated to avoid really getting hit hard with this virus. And again, it was location, bottom of the world, thousands of miles away from any major civilization of any sort. And it was summertime. And on top of that, we have an incredibly spread out population with only 2 major urban areas. And even though we've got 2 major urban areas, the population is still spread out. And if you drove around Auckland here, or even Wellington City, majority of the population, over 95% of the population, live in individual residences. So, there's the truth. It wasn't our government that saved the world. It wasn't Jacinda, I can do no wrong, our queen, our illustrious leader, Ardern, that saved us from coronavirus. Because sure as shit, they were trying to get this country infected. Right now, as I said, it stands at roughly around 100,000 New Zealanders have returned from overseas, and there's more wanting to return. So between shutting the country down, bringing in hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders from overseas, and there's going to be tens of thousands of even more New Zealanders coming in from overseas. Yeah, it's an absolute perfect recipe for economic disaster. So we're just at the beginning of this economic disaster. If they had not shut the country down and kept industry running, and if they had actually put people into quarantine facilities from the word go, and actually been more strict in regards to the amount of people that they were bringing back into the country. I understand bringing people that were traveling overseas back home, but if you have made the conscious decision to leave this country and live overseas like I have, then suck it up, buttercup. Because basically the situation that we're in now is actually riding on the shoulders of all those individuals that flew home in this state of panic. Because the government used those individuals to justify and back up their shutting down of New Zealand. That's the truth. God's honest truth. So that's the video. Hope it's helped some of you out. And yeah, I'm sure it's going to piss a few people off also, but who cares? That's the truth. Talk to you later.